Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be looking at part 2 of Oversimplified American Revolution. As always, I will include a link to the original content in the description down below. Please head over to Oversimplified and show them some love and support if you like what you see here today. Alright, with that said, we're just going to go ahead and get into this and see what else we can learn about the American Revolution.
This video was made possible by Brilliant, math and science done right. Keep watching until the end of the video to learn how you can get 20% off the annual premium subscription.
Alright, part 2.
Washington's butt was sufficiently kicked. Winter was here. His troops' morale was low, some just up and left. Washington needed to do something, anything to restore faith in the revolution. The British had spread throughout New Jersey and settled in for a winter of drinking cider and partying hard.
I don't think they had it quite that good. Probably a slight exaggeration, but they almost certainly had it better than the Continental Army did.
Nobody expected an attack in the winter, so Washington started making plans for an attack in the winter. The British...
Yeah, and that's not a bad idea necessarily. Typically, especially in this era and before this era, fighting was done during campaigning season, which would be once you get far enough into spring that the roads aren't going to be particularly muddy from snowmelt or from early rains. And then you're going to want to be done before the snow starts settling in. You can fight in the winter, but it's a lot more difficult to maneuver your army, to keep your supply lines open. So it just was avoided as much as possible, typically. But if a good opportunity presents itself, it's quite feasible to take advantage of the winter and launching an attack. But you really have to be careful because, like I said, winter conditions can really mess with your ability to be mobile and to keep your supply lines open or even to have supplies available. You certainly aren't going to be living off the land in the winter.
Had hired a large force of Hessian mercenaries from the German states of Hesse-Kassel and Hesse-Hanau to fight the rebels. It was these mercenaries that were stationed across the Delaware River from Washington and his army. And there were more Hessian reinforcements incoming, but they made an unscheduled stop because their commander got thirsty. No, not that kind of thirsty. That kind of thirsty. It was Christmas Eve with a blizzard outside when Washington heard the Hessian defenses were down, and he decided to attack. He made a perilous crossing of the icy Delaware River with 2,400 men and marched 9 miles to Trenton, where he caught the Hessian forces completely off guard.
Okay, I'm going to go back because I think he made an error here.
That kind of thirsty. That kind of thirsty. It was Christmas Eve with a blizzard outside.
He did. The crossing of the Delaware and the attack were done not on Christmas Eve, which traditionally is the evening of the 24th. It was done on the eve of Christmas Day. So the evening of the 25th, not the evening of the 24th. And then it carried over into the 26th. So it wasn't Christmas Eve as we think of Christmas Eve. It was the evening of Christmas Day, the 25th.
When Washington heard the Hessian defenses were down and he decided to attack. He made a perilous crossing of the icy Delaware River with 2,400 men and marched 9 miles to Trenton, where he caught the Hessian forces completely off guard. After a short but fierce battle, the Hessians surrendered in droves. It was a much-needed victory that sent a clear message, not only to the British, but to Americans across the colonies. The war was far from lost. General Cornwallis led the British forces south to counterattack the Americans, but in a series of battles, Washington's defensive positioning and flanking maneuvers defeated the British 3 times in 10 days, and the British decided to abandon southern New Jersey for the rest of the winter. Washington finally set up a winter camp in Morristown, but for the Americans, there was much less partying than the British. Elsewhere, the British had taken Newport, Rhode Island, because it was a good naval base. In the south, they failed to take Charleston, South Carolina, which left British loyalists unsupported and vulnerable to more harassment and even mass expulsion. Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to France on a mission to convince them to join the war, and while the French generally loved any opportunity to hoodwink the Brits, they didn't want to join unless it was a sure win. So for now, Franklin spent his days chilling out and chasing tail. The British Parliament couldn't believe
he did do that. Franklin was quite the womanizer. However, he also was busy fulfilling his diplomatic role as well. So don't let this fool you into thinking that all he was doing was partying with the ladies, philandering and all that. He was he and others as well were actively recruiting French noblemen to head to the United States to help support the revolution. In fact, they were so good at it that they were really irritating Washington because he was getting this influx of French noblemen, all of whom thought they deserved to be officers and to have, all the benefits thereof. They just felt that it was their right as noblemen who have these high ranks to be paid, to have be provided with everything they need, and that just wasn't how it worked. And Washington and several other high-ranking military officials at the time were getting really annoyed with the delegation in France for sending these people over. That was until one particular French nobleman showed up, and that would be the Marquis de Lafayette. He was the exception to the rule for all the right reasons. If you're not familiar with his story, the only thing I'm going to say about it here, because we don't want to turn this into a video on the life and times of Lafayette, but he basically went AWOL in order to join the American Revolution. He had just recently been promoted to an officer in the French army, or the French military, I guess I should say. And he was expressly told by the king that he was not to go to America. So he bought his own ship with his own money and did so anyway. And there was the king ordered his arrest. There were people looking for him. He brought his own ship over to the United States. He had to sneak ashore because people were looking for him. And he contacted Washington and was basically told, "I'm done with you French noblemen who think you're owed everything." And Lafayette said, no, you misunderstand me. I will work without pay. I will provide my own equipment. I just want this opportunity to participate in this revolution because I believe in these principles. And he won Washington over. Washington gave him a chance, and Lafayette proved to be an invaluable ally. And but the point I'm trying to make here is that let's not get the idea that, first of all, that Franklin was the only one over there in a diplomatic role. He will be joined by others later, but there are other people actively in France recruiting men, trying to convince people to support the revolution, so on and so forth. But a lot of the French noblemen that they convinced to help are not necessarily appreciated by Washington and some of the other military leaders in the United States. That's the main point I'm going for.
The war wasn't over yet, and the pressure was on to end it. So the British came up with a plan. General Burgoyne in Montreal and General William Howe in New York would advance through the Hudson Valley and meet in the middle, splitting the colonies in two, and thus screwing over the American communication lines.
Great plan.
Burgoyne began his movement south, and after taking Fort Ticonderoga quite easily, he then came across heavy American resistance. So he sent Howe a dingle-dongle asking if he'd be showing up anytime soon.
I doubt he did that. He might have sent a message, though.
Meanwhile, Howe had completely abandoned the plan and gone for all out personal glory by capturing the American capital, Philadelphia. He defeated Washington and his army at Brandywine Creek by using the old hit him with a decoy and flank him from behind tactic. And Philadelphia was now in British hands, forcing Congress to escape to York. But Burgoyne was left on his own to face the ever-increasing American force in Saratoga. American General Horatio Gates teamed up with our old friend Benedict Arnold to deal one final blow to Burgoyne's army. Arnold wanted to take the fight to the British, but Gates wanted to wait for the British to come to them. After a heated debate, Gates, the senior officer, told Arnold to go to his room, but Arnold defied his orders, and at the Battle of Bemis Heights he charged at the British and obliterated them. Great job, Horatio. By the way, what happened to that other guy who was in Saratoga? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him. Ouch.
Yeah, that's oversimplified as always. But yeah, Benedict Arnold contributed a lot to the revolution, and he was constantly watching other people get credit for things that he had done, or at least getting more credit and praise for things that he had equally participated in or maybe even contributed more. And it's going to start taking a toll on him, especially later on when he's not getting his pay. And yeah, the final straw is going to be when he gets reprimanded by Washington. At that point, he's just done with it all.
Hey, George, didn't I do a great job? Taking Philadelphia and all? Didn't I? You're fired. Both Burgoyne and Howe returned to Great Britain.
Yeah, if you got a plan, especially if that plan, if other people are depending on you, you can't just go off and do your own thing. You're leaving your teammates high and dry, and it can get a lot of people killed when we're talking about war. So kudos for catching Philadelphia, but that was not the plan, and that was a short-term goal that cost you potentially a long-term victory.
And leaving British General Henry Clinton to take charge of the war. And the war was about to take a nasty turn, because with the victory at Saratoga, the French were finally ready to join the Americans. All right, Benny, we're in. Hey, isn't this kind of funny? You know, because you're a republic trying to overthrow an absolute monarchy, and I'm an absolute monarchy helping you? Like, could you imagine if your revolution inspired my people to revolt against me, and then they imprisoned me and all my family, and they chopped all of our heads off? Could you imagine? That's called foreshadowing.
All right. Couple of things there. First of all, the Americans were not trying to overthrow the monarchy. They were perfectly fine with having a king over in England, as long as that king left them alone over in America. So they weren't trying to overthrow a monarchy. They were trying to declare independence from a monarch, but the monarch would stay in place. They had no plan of going over to England and dethroning the monarch. So slightly different there, Louis. The other thing I want to toss in here is that we really cannot understate the importance of French support during the American Revolution. It's extremely unlikely that we would have won without it. Now, I've heard people argue, oh no, the British had other things going on they had to worry about, and fighting overseas was, that far away was difficult, and the Americans would have just strung it out until they got tired of fighting. But there's some problems with some of these arguments. For one thing, the idea that the Americans would have kept fighting, it might have taken longer, but they would have worn the British down, and the British would have eventually gotten tired and just given up. The problem with that is that when the Revolutionary War started, America had a very finite amount of guns and munitions and ammo and everything else you need to fight and sustain a war. They had very, very little in terms of production power for making guns and especially ammunition and everything else you need to wage a war. So, one big problem with this idea of they just have kept fighting until the British got tired is they would have been out of ammo within a year. And they did not have the factory to produce more bullets on a large scale, or gunpowder, or everything else they needed. They were very much reliant on imports. Who was giving us the weapons, the ammo, and the bullets, the powder, the guns? France and Spain. Even before France officially joins the war, the French are shipping us a lot of military supplies. We'll just make it simple, military supplies. Some of it they're smuggling in themselves, some of it they're smuggling in through Spain. Spain is also supplying a little, but not nearly as much as the French. They are more often working as smugglers, bringing the stuff in. So we might not even have made it to this point without French intervention, especially if the British were smart enough to realize that America only had really 2 weapon factories in the country at a time, capture them right away, and that's pretty much all she wrote. The other issue is money. The Continental Congress famously was having a very hard time paying the soldiers, providing them with equipment, providing them with clothes. Especially a little bit later in the war, they kept having more and more trouble funding the whole effort. What money they were getting, again, a lot of that was coming from the French and the Spanish. So it's not just the French entering the war and supplying soldiers and supplying ships, although that's actually critical too, especially the ships. But they're also funding the war to a large extent. They are providing the weapons to a large extent. Now, later in the war, the colonies do set up more manufactories for some of these supplies, but they need time to get that going. Then they need the funding to get it going. So let's not kid ourselves into thinking that we could have won without France and Spain. Sure, there's always that off chance. But the British weren't as distracted as you might think they were. Yes, they had other things going on, but nothing major. And what they did have going on tended to be tied to France and Spain, who were kind of doing it specifically because the British were distracted by us, and one of the reasons we had this semi-alliance going on early on, and then later an official alliance between the U.S. and Spain. Or not Spain, France. Spain actually never allied with the United States or the colonies. They did, however, ally with France. So, but that was a slightly different thing again. Anyway, I think I've rambled enough about this, but this is one of those things where I just hear too many people trying to argue that we didn't need the French help and we could have won it without them. Sure, it's possible, but ridiculously, infinitesimally small chance. Something would have had to have happened that would have been a much bigger diversion to the British than what actually did happen. They were having little skirmishes with the Irish. They solved that diplomatically. They didn't really even need to use force. They had a couple of small problems in India, but that was really about it.
For now in America, winter was here once again, which meant yet more disease, more starvation, and even a little mutiny.
Oh, and I should add that the colonies were having problems too dealing with loyalists. So it's not like we weren't being distracted either.
After losing Philadelphia, Washington's job was again on the line, but suddenly, a Prussian guy with a very fancy name, hired by Benjamin Franklin, showed up out of nowhere and said, Hey, I'm here to give your men a European military training. And train them he did. They learned how to shoot accurately, how to march in formation, where to poop and where not to. And
that's a surprisingly big deal. Actually, it's not really that surprising. It's surprising that people need to be told that. But then again, we know that poor sanitation can cause disease. A little different this time. And I brought this up in other videos. I'll bring it up again here. The further back you go in time, the more prominent disease is as a killer in war. When you look at war deaths through history, especially the further back you go, the more often that's going to be death from diseases. Because that's by far and away the biggest killer in most wars historically. It was only recently that with advances in medication combined with advances in weapons that we're starting to see more weapons killing people than disease. That's a recent development. In the past, far more likely people would die of disease. And even in modern warfare, when you crowd a lot of people together, you're putting it at risk of disease. Certainly World War I, even though we had modern medicine, well, relatively modern medicine, and much better hygiene, you still see the Spanish flu killing millions of people around the world. And a lot of that had to do with soldiers carrying it and being in cramped close quarters, spreading it among themselves, and then traveling around, spreading it as they go. So things like teaching them where to go to the bathroom is actually critically important because it helps lower the risk of disease. So we might laugh at this, but this was actually a critical aspect of the war that you really needed to pay attention to, because you're putting yourself and the rest of the your fellow soldiers at risk.
Strict punishments were handed out to any who didn't comply. Washington's army came out of the winter in 1778 a new and improved force, ready to take Philadelphia back from the British. In the end, though, they didn't have to. With the French entry into the war, the British ordered General Clinton to evacuate Philadelphia and consolidate all of the British forces in New York. So Washington sent Benedict Arnold to reoccupy and secure the city as he pursued the British through New Jersey on land, eventually finding a good opportunity to attack at Monmouth Courthouse. The battle took place on a sweltering hot summer's day, and as many soldiers died from heat stroke as they did from battle. In the end, after some incompetence/borderline treason from Washington's second-in-command, it was a draw. And in this war, a draw is kind of a victory for the Americans. Next up, let's talk about this guy. This is John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones is handsome, Scottish, and absolutely insane. When the war first broke out, everyone was like, how did the colonies expect to stand up to the might of the British Navy with their meager fleet of converted merchantmen? Yep, try telling that to John Paul Jones. This guy sailed to the British Isles, somehow captured a British ship off the coast of Ireland, and brought it back to France. Then he returned, attacking more ships, raiding towns, and evading capture the entire time. These are basically pirate tactics. But hey, if it works, it works. In one incident, he captured a British ship and returned to a Dutch port without an official ensign because his was lost during the battle. That's a big no-no and can have you arrested as a pirate. The Dutch helped him out by quickly creating a design based on Benjamin Franklin's description of what the American flag should look like, and they entered it into their records as an official U.S. flag.
It looks kind of cool there on the mast.
The whole campaign probably played heavily on British morale and brought into question their ability to win the war. And fun fact, he was so cool that one of the towns he raided in 1778 gave him an official honorary pardon in 1999.
Yeah, John Paul Jones was actually quite impressive. We did do a reaction to Fat Electrician's storytelling time on John Paul Jones. Really well done. I really enjoyed that one. This guy was pretty impressive, honestly. He was a little daring, and like he said, he was a little on the crazy side. Some of the stunts he pulled were textbook damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead. He was clever. He was remarkably effective. And after the American Revolution, he actually joined the Russian Navy, fighting under Catherine the Great in wars with the Turks, with the Ottomans, down in the Black Sea. So yeah, John Paul Jones is one of my favorite Revolutionary War characters, just because he's fun. And he was a good friend and disciple of Benjamin Franklin. Enough said about that.
One of the towns he raided in 1778.
Oh, and Whitehaven, by the way, I highly recommend checking out that electrician's story on John Paul Jones, because the whole Whitehaven thing is a great story in and of itself.
Gave him an official honorary pardon in 1999. Keep ripping in heaven, John Paul Jones.
Yep.
You're an angel now. What the Continental Navy was lacking in resources, though, the French entry into the war made up for. The French began with naval skirmishes in the English Channel, and they sent a large fleet to America, although it sustained a lot of damage in a storm off Rhode Island. The Americans were hoping for a bigger commitment from the French, so John Adams went to France to help Benjamin Franklin continue negotiations. Oh good, you're finally here. Check this out. Hey ladies, I'd like to fly you like a kite, because you're electrifying. Isn't this great? Is this what you've been doing? Yeah, why? We were sent here on a diplomatic mission to secure military support from France, not to philander with the locals. Wait, no, ladies, come back. Worst wingman ever.
I suspect that John Adams probably would be one of the worst wingmen ever. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's accurate.
But the Americans would get some more help. The Dutch provided aid, although they never formed an official alliance. More significantly, though, the Spanish, who had already been providing aid, officially joined the war in June 1779. They would
Yes, but as I said before, they did not join it on the side of the colonies. They they allied with France for separate reasons. But they were supporting the colonies even before this. And in fact, while they were supporting the colonies, they also had at least one significant spy in the American forces, Agent 13 of Spain, better known as General James Wilkinson, who was one of the prominent generals, or would become anyway a prominent general, but was certainly active during this war and was well known and well regarded. Wilkinson will later get tied up in a lot of scandals. He becomes associated with Aaron Burr. Yes, that Aaron Burr. And he participates in some filibustering schemes. And no, I'm not talking about a political maneuver. Filibustering in this context would be heading out to the west and trying to set up an independent kingdom of your own. He and Aaron Burr both kind of had designs along those lines. But he was an active spy for Spain. And he would also actually tip Spain off about the Lewis and Clark expedition and advise them to do whatever they needed to do to stop Lewis and Clark from completing their journey. The Spanish did actually send out multiple military expeditions to capture or kill Lewis and Clark. So, yeah, that happened too.
Provide support in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast, campaigns that heavily impacted the Native American tribes in those areas. Both sides actually enlisted the help of Native American tribes throughout the war, sometimes even pitting those tribes against each other. In the summer of 1779, after a series of raids against the Americans by the Iroquois, Washington organized an expedition that burned down more than 40 villages, forcing the tribes to relocate to Canada for British protection. And another group that shouldn't go unmentioned were African Americans, both free and enslaved. They joined both sides of the war, hoping to gain their freedom. But afterwards, many were simply returned to slavery, particularly those who had fought for the Americans. Despite owning slaves himself, Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but out of fear of offending the Southern colonies, this was removed from the final draft.
Yeah, that is a thing. Jefferson did put in some explicit complaint about slavery in the Declaration, but because they needed support from the Southern colonies, he had to remove it. And I mentioned this previously in the previous video, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but we have to remember that Jefferson did the actual writing of the Declaration, and he was certainly one of the key members in writing it, in terms of designing it and figuring out what it's going to say. But it was a small committee. Benjamin Franklin was on it, John Adams was on it, and others. So we can't give him full credit for the ideas, just for the actual writing and choosing the words. And he was chosen specifically because he was known to have a way with words. But he gets a lot of flack for having said all men are created equal, and then being a slave owner. He was far from the only slave owner among the founding fathers, and all men are created equal was not his initial concept. That comes straight from John Locke, who wrote All Men Are Created Equal, and entitled to Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Property in the case of John Locke. But I've mentioned all this before. So we have to kind of separate Jefferson as the guy who wrote the Declaration and understand that it was a committee thing and that a lot of voices were put into it, and a lot of what Jefferson wanted in it, including a condemnation of slavery, he was forced to take out because you couldn't alienate the Southern colonies.
For the same reason, the American Army stopped enlisting African American men in 1775, a policy that Washington, a slave owner himself, supported, but they were forced to reverse the policy after the British promised freedom to any slaves who joined them. In general, you stood a better chance of gaining freedom if you fought for the British. However, even those that left with the British after the war suffered mistreatment and discrimination in their new lives outside of America. Our good friend Benedict Arnold is now in charge of Philadelphia, having a good time, partying down with, and even marrying a member of the Philadelphia elite. The same elite that had partied down with the British when they controlled the city. And suddenly, the people of Philadelphia, including the state governor, started accusing Arnold of having pro-British sentiments. To keep the people happy, Washington wrote a letter rebuking Arnold, calling his conduct imprudent and improper, and that was too many ouchies for Benedict Arnold to handle. He asked Washington to put him in charge of the fort at West Point. Then he contacted the British, offering to hand the plans of the fort over to them and join their side. Our good friend Benedict Arnold is our good friend no more. Luckily, the treasonous plans were discovered on a captured...
But as I mentioned earlier, it was a little more complicated than that. It had a series of disappointments where he was passed over for things that he felt he deserved credit for. In some cases, rightfully, he was not getting paid what he was promised, or at all at some points. And Washington rebuking him was pretty much the last straw. He respected Washington, Washington respected him, and to have Washington condemn him was just more than he was willing to put up with.
British officer, but Arnold managed to escape before he was arrested. As a British brigadier general, he would go on to lead raids against American cities, most notably his raid of Richmond, Virginia in 1781. His betrayal shook George Washington, who had once again set up camp at Morristown. His leadership somehow held the Continental Army together through the harshest winter of the war. We're entering 1780, and Parliament was hopping mad that the war still wasn't over. The British debt was soaring, and despite taking parts of Massachusetts in late 1779, the North was in a stalemate, so the British decided to make a major shift in strategy to the South, an economically rich area with a higher level of support
which is
for
a
the
good
British,
idea.
or so the British thought. A year
If you're not having luck up in the North, try the South.
earlier, they had captured the
For one thing, there are more loyalists in the South, so you've got that going for you.
underdefended city of Savannah, Georgia easily, and a joint American-French counter-siege failed. Now, they laid siege to Charleston, South Carolina. It fell within months, with thousands of American troops surrendering to the British, a costly defeat. The British quickly moved to take control, and they sent stereotypical Hollywood villain with a British accent, Bannister
Tarleton,
the Butcher
yep.
Tarleton, into the backcountry, where he hunted down rebels and destroyed them with ruthless brutality. The British...
If you've seen Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot, the villain there is based on Tarleton. Tarleton had quite the reputation for excess brutality.
British presence also inspired local loyalist militias in the backcountry to rise up against their persecutors. The British really seemed to be onto something with their new strategy, and the ball was very much in Washington's court. I'm gonna send my most loyal general, Nathaniel Greene, to the south to stop the British. Gonna have to overrule you there, George. We're sending hero of Saratoga and your biggest rival, Horatio Gates. Watch this, George. I'm gonna save the day again, everybody will love me, and I'm gonna get your job. Here I go. And he got into one battle with Cornwallis, got annihilated, and ran away. Alrighty, let's go with your guy. Nathaniel Greene knew the British outnumbered his own forces and wouldn't be defeated with conventional tactics, so he had to think outside the box. He split his army into two, said, "Hey big boy, look at me," and then they went running in two different directions. Cornwallis sent Tarleton after Morgan, and he caught up with him at Cowpens, where Morgan proceeded to kick Tarleton's butt. Then the two led Cornwallis on a wild chase through North Carolina, his bigger and better equipped army much heavier and slower than Greene's quick and mobile troops. Greene led Cornwallis further and further from his supply line, then crossed the Dan River into Virginia, picked up some reinforcements, and turned back to face the now exhausted British. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, the two sides engaged in vicious close combat. Cornwallis, fearing loss, fired his big guns into the chaotic fighting, cutting down many of his own men. Greene retreated, giving Cornwallis the victory, but Cornwallis lost a quarter of his men in the fighting, so it fell.
So, I've said this in previous videos as well, but historically, friendly fire is significant. It probably still is today. I'm not sure about modern statistics, but historically speaking, friendly fire was devastating. A much higher percentage of casualties were caused by friendly fire than I think most people realize.
Felt much more like a British defeat. At this point, both sides desperately needed something to happen soon to end the fighting. The British were running out of money, while the Americans were again facing mutinies as the men went without pay or even basic living needs. Fortunately, the French were now showing up in greater numbers and were ready to fight. After his encounter with Greene, Cornwallis decided the only way to win the South was to first prevent the Southern Continental Army from using Virginia as a supply base. So he abandoned the Carolinas, moving to Wilmington and on to Yorktown, a position the British believed would be easy to supply and support. On his march to Yorktown, he raided many farms, stealing horses and supplies from the locals, but also freeing thousands of slaves, many of whom joined him. The French saw Cornwallis's new position as an opportunity to land a decisive blow on the British.
All right,
Washington wanted to
Rochambeau.
attack Clinton in New York, but the French said it was a really dumb idea. And to be fair, it was. Instead, Washington sent out fake dispatches to make it look like they would attack Clinton, but secretly their combined force marched all the way down to Virginia. A large French fleet under the command of Comte de Grasse arrived and successfully cleared the British Navy out of the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, this is probably a good point to talk about one of the other things that made Washington a great leader. I said in the previous video, he was not necessarily an exceptional general in the military sense. His battle tactics and his strategies were decent, but nothing to write home about. He was a great leader of men. He knew how to inspire people. He knew how to get them to do things they might not normally do. He was very good at that. But another thing he was surprisingly good at was espionage. Washington created his own spy ring, and it was quite effective. It really made a big difference. So when we think of Washington, one aspect of his success was his ability to gain information quickly, accurately, and to use misdirection as well. which you just saw right up here. His espionage and spycraft was actually quite impressive.
The combined land and naval forces then laid siege to Cornwallis's army in Yorktown. The American and French forces tightened in around the city, raining artillery down on Cornwallis, who desperately appealed to Clinton for aid, but Clinton was unusually chilled out about the whole thing. Cornwallis held out for nearly a month before he had no choice but to surrender. Over 7,000 British troops were captured, a crushing defeat, and with that, Parliament had reached the end of its rope. The war just wasn't worth it, and it needed to end now. The British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but fighting between the two sides mostly ceased as peace negotiations opened up in Paris. The resulting treaty in 1783 saw Great Britain remove its troops from American soil, recognize U.S. independence.
Right, but not from the continent. So they do remove their troops from the colonies, but they still have fortresses west of the Appalachians. So that's going to cause some issues later on. So let's not mistake him saying they removed their troops from America to mean that they removed all their military presence. Of course, they still had Canada, but they also had forts in what will become United States west of the Appalachian Mountains, so we got to keep that in mind.
And cede territory up to the Mississippi River. In return, the Americans agreed to pay any debt still owed to Britain and gave fair treatment to any colonists who had remained loyal to the crown. The Spanish got Florida, while the French got an economic crisis that led to its own revolution a decade later. Washington retired to his home in Mount Vernon, wishing his men farewell by saying, "I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." He hoped to live out the rest of his days in peace. But
Not going to
unfortunately
happen
for him, a number of people wanted him to be the first leader of the new country. And by a number of people, I mean literally everyone. The first election campaign in American history was basically a grassroots effort to convince Washington to accept the office.
Washington really wanted to retire. He made that abundantly clear, but people were just not going to let him do so.
Sworn in on April 30th, 1789, and he himself established many of the standards and limitations of what the American leader should be. First of all, there was debate on what he should be called. Is he a king? Is he our glorious leader?
Yep.
In the end, they went for a word that at the time was pretty modest. President, like the...
Yeah, he did, and good on him for doing that, because some of the people here very much wanted titles of royalty. Not necessarily king, but Adams and Hamilton in particular wanted a lot of the trappings of royalty. They wanted formal titles like His Majesty or Your Grace to be used for the president. They really kind of wanted the president to be modeled, at least from a ceremonial standpoint, if that makes any sense, European royalty. Others, like Jefferson and Madison, of course, were quite the opposite, and Washington was kind of, at least in this particular aspect, kind of on their side. He didn't want the trappings of a king.
President of your local bowling club or office bake sale committee. He set up a cabinet of expert advisors, knowing that no president could know everything, no matter how much of a stable genius they claimed to be. He proposed...
That was quite the dig. That was another thing that Washington was good at. I mentioned this in the previous video, but he was good at listening to people and taking advice. So it's not at all surprising that he would want a cabinet of advisors and that he would pick people from all sides of the political spectrum. We really didn't have political parties like we do today. And Washington's really not the kind of guy that's going to want just yes men. He's going to want people like Jefferson, for example, that are going to disagree with him, or at least disagree with Adams, disagree with Hamilton, because he understood the value of that. And I wish more people now understood the value of that. You want to have a large pool, or at least a decent pool of differing opinions, because that's how you can make the best decisions. If you've just got yes men, they're going to tell you what they think you want to hear, and it may not be what you need to hear. In fact, quite often it's definitely not going to be what you need to hear. So is this decision not only to have a cabinet, but to staff it with people who had a wide variety of views was a good precedent to set, and I wish that more presidents now would be a little more practical, I guess, in their decision making when it comes to appointing cabinet members. and less political and more who's the best man for the job. I don't care if they're going to agree with me. I want them to put it like it is. I want them to know the topic, what they're talking about, and I want them to tell me straight up what it is, what the situation is, what the options are, and then go from there. But that's not what we really have anymore, which is unfortunate.
Proposed major legislation to Congress and gave an annual State of the Union address to keep his own power in check. He stated that the U.S. should remain neutral in foreign conflicts, and in the end, he voluntarily gave up his power after just 2 terms. He could have made the presidency anything he wanted, but his careful and cautious actions helped set the precedent of an office that is powerful in its limitations, decisive through its diplomacy, and respected in its humility. And so the United States was born, and everything was perfect. It had no problems, not a single one. Certainly nothing that would, I don't know, cause such an extreme divide that it would lead to a civil war.
Yeah, like building the Constitution around the institution of slavery, maybe? Oops.
Anyway, moving on.
Quick through this, I'll be right back. All right, it does look like we're done. I just wanted to make sure. So, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I tried to contribute what I could. There's a lot more to talk about with the American Revolution, obviously. This is oversimplified. It's called that for a reason, but I think he did a pretty good job at just giving the basic picture. Many of the high points, a few minor mistakes here and there, but nothing worth freaking out over. We will be continuing with Oversimplified Saturdays. I am going through the back catalog now. Anything that I haven't already covered in this channel, we'll be doing. Generally speaking, I'll just go to the oldest to the newest so that we can get caught up with where he is now. And with that said, I think we're done. And I will see you all next Saturday. So thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.